Before we begin today, we're going to take a look at two different forms of liberalism that'll help you to understand some of the changes in American society. So go ahead and, from the textbook excerpts provided, compare and contrast what we call classical liberalism with New Deal liberalism. So go ahead and hit that pause button right there and investigate these two. All right, what we're going to examine today is now the term liberalism and its involvement in the Second World War, and particularly in examining this prompt right here, evaluate the connection between democratic liberalism and American participation in the Second World War. So we're going to do this like a long essay today. We're going to explore the context, the argument dealing with liberalism and American involvement, and then how America's involvement in the Second World War helped in the end to expand liberalism at home and also in the war as well. So the context we're going to take a look at today deals with the following here. So take a look at these images, and what you want to be able to generate is perhaps both the international context, what's going on in the world in the 1930s, and also in the 1940s as well. And to think about things in regards to classical liberalism, what does it mean in regards to freedom and the development of democracy in the United States in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and how that may contrast with some of the other elements that are going on. So take a look at the images that are provided here to help you define what liberalism is and how it has been expressed in the United States over time. Hopefully what you're able to generate is one of the items of liberalism is what is developed in New Deal liberalism as well. Not just simply the freedom of speech, but then also things like freedom from want and a new means of expressing American liberalism. Because the reality is, if you're poor, if you can't sustain a living for yourself here, you may not actually be free. And so New Deal liberalism, it generates a new form of rights that may be guaranteed by an expanding federal government. So as a result of this, we're going to make the argument here. The crisis brought about by the Second World War, and hopefully in the context you're able to talk about the rise of authoritarianism across the globe, and how the United States, one, played a vital role in the military defeat of authoritarianism, but yet also at the exact same time created greater social mobility for groups. So again, New Deal liberalism being implemented in the United States at this point here. So from the lecture responses, from the lecture here, you're going to be able to respond and create at least two sets of evidence that will support this particular thesis. So we start off in regards to the home front and the notion that this war, unlike the First World War, would actually be fought for democracy. And in order to create that image of the United States as the defenders of democracy, a massive propaganda campaign was created by the OWI, the Office of War Information. And so you're going to see posters like we find in other modern states to try to convince people, hey, you've got to fight, hey, you've got to provide, because in the end, this is a war about liberty, and not just simply liberty for white Americans, but all Americans, of all sorts of religious backgrounds, all sorts of ethnic backgrounds, and not only that, but that if there is a gender divide, then women should also play a major role. And so that we start to see one of the most famous images in American history, Rosie the Riveter, for instance, that we see generated from the OWI campaign. And really, for the first time, we start to see the notion of what we call the United Nations, which Roosevelt utilized as a term to describe the Allies as fighters of democracy and liberalism, fighting for freedom across the globe, and eventually will be implemented in the organization that becomes the United Nations as well. Frank Capra, the famed film producer at the time, was actually brought about by the OWI to create a series of films called Why We Fight. And so in the listing for this video, you can go and take a look at some of the video clips of what Capra produced and what it was generated for. So take a look at that link that's provided in the listing below. So in a lot of ways, the OWI becomes an try to convinces the American audience in the end to fight for democracy. But there are other things that the United States did in the home front that would help to generate this liberalism. Again, stemming out of the Great Depression, the idea of New Deal liberalism that the state will provide for general needs may in the end be generated by the new revenue that is being produced by the state as well. And so for the first time, we actually have massive taxation across the board in the United States through the Revenue Act of 1942 as a means to pay for the war. But what it does is that it revolutionizes the tax structure in the United States, and it increases the number who actually paid income taxes from 13 million people to about 50 million people. But at the same time, these taxes in the end are going to try to reduce the amount of excess profits that are garnered by the rich. And as a result of this, it's meant to spread the burden of taxation all across the economic spectrum. At the same time, it also forces the rich to bear a larger burden of the tax revenue than ever before. And in doing so, it generates a progressive tax where the wealthy in the end will pay more. And in a lot of ways, this was really the only time in American modern history where wealth was actually significantly redistributed. So as there's greater production in regards to war goods and war items, more people employed than ever before. Yes, people were taxed, but the rich, which were getting richer as a result of war production, ended up paying, you could make an argument, their fair share. And that's done through the Revenue Act of 1942. It also did a number of things in regards to stabilizing prices and rents that usually wartime profiteering will produce here. So oftentimes when war happens, people are going to hoard items and goods. There's a lot of speculation in regards to prices. And so it ensured that there would be price limits. And much of this is done by the Office of Price Administration as well, to ensure that there was not a lack of consumer goods, that there would be rationing where there needed to be rationing for things like butter, coffee, sugar, gasoline, and so forth, so that there's enough for the war effort, but there's enough price control such that as inflation does occur, the consumers themselves would not be gouged, and that they would have at least some access to consumer goods during this particular time here. There's also, again, we talked about rationing here as well. It's hard to find tires, cars, metal typewriters, bicycles, stoves, those sort of things at this time, because all that was governed by this new federal agency called the Office of Price Administration. But again, it ensures that people still at least had the basic amount of access to consumer goods and food during a time of possible hoarding. And so all this is going to, again, generate a sense that, look, the state is going to help to provide the needs of all individuals, if not most individuals in the United States. And there's also greater access to labor, and people are now receiving and gaining more jobs in wartime industries than ever before. And the first time in American history, the United States government is actually favoring labor. The National War Labor Board was created so that unions would end up getting a chance to be able to bargain in order as a means for the government to prevent major strikes from occurring in a time of war. And so they're going to try to address equal wages or greater equality in wages for all people. A great example of this, if you look at that picture on the right there, the president of the Corporation Montgomery Ward, which is a department store, they have catalogs and so forth, selling retail goods and so forth here, ended up defying a pro-union order. And usually the U.S. Army is brought in to deal with unions and the workers. But instead, this time, the Army came in and seized Montgomery Ward's headquarters and ended up evicting the president from his office. And you see they're carrying him out across the way here. So again, more labor rights than ever before. What was proposed, and particularly by the creation of the National Resource Planning Board, is the creation of a full employment plan. Now, this does not get enacted, but this is very much a sign of the times here, where people are calling for a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights, where it's supposed to generate new levels of economic rights for everyone. Now, FDR used this in his re-election campaign of 1944. Nothing came out of it initially, but just sort of the logic of it starts to produce the notion of New Deal liberalism in the minds of Americans. Things like a guarantee of jobs, that if you're a farmer, you can provide adequate food and clothing for your family through a decent return for your crops. The right of every businessman, large and small, to be able to trade in an environment of freedom. The right of every family to live in a decent home, adequate medical care, opportunity to achieve good health, adequate protection from economic fears of old age, sickness. So all of this stuff, we start to see the burgeoning social welfare state that really starts to develop in the 20th century at this time. We briefly discussed women and their access to the war industry. So the Rosie DeRiveter campaign, women in the industrial workforce, but also groups like the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the closest in the United States where women were entered into combat. In this case here, they actually flew bomber planes from American factories in North America to places like Britain and France as well. So to whack close to combat, but again, flying actual combat aircraft. But one of the most important is what is known as the GI Bill of Rights, which in the end is the United States government saying, look, if you serve and you fight, we're going to help you in set up your life afterwards. So things like higher education, job training, and help in regards to home ownership, all of a sudden was now in reach for millions of American veterans. And in fact, by 1951, nearly 8 million veterans had received educational and training benefits. About 2.4 million had received a total of about $13 billion in federal loans for new homes, farms, and businesses. At no time in American history has a generation, in a lot of ways, been set up for success in this particular way, and all brought about again by some of these new policies coming out of the Second World War. To add to this, minority groups, particularly Black Americans, are going to find themselves with new opportunities outside of sharecropping and the agricultural sector, and so many of them will start to enter into the workforce in the South, in the newly industrialized South. We talk about the great migration of men and women to the north into cities like Chicago and Detroit and New York, but then also now with the Second World War out west as well to new military bases and factories in the West Coast in cities like Oakland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego as well. In addition to this, the Second World War implemented manpower like never before in larger numbers. But the question is, do minorities have access to serve in the military? And so we've had previous instances of this discrimination. There's racism that said, look, non-white men could not fight with the same zeal and ability as white men. However, there were eventually segregated groups that in the end would be brought into the United States military and played major roles in the success of the United States in fighting the Second World War. We've got instances like the Navajo code talkers in the Pacific who helped to create a radio code that could not be deciphered by the enemy. You've got groups like the 92nd and 93rd Infantrymen, black regiments that were formed, that were segregated, led by white officers, but fought with great distinction in Europe. And of course, the Tuskegee Airmen, the first minority officers, for instance, flying in the U.S. Army Air Force as a segregated unit, but also one of the most decorated air groups in the war. And the 442nd Infantry, Nisei Japanese Americans who, despite their family being put into concentration and internment camps, decided to fight for the United States and fought with great distinction, and probably the most decorated unit of the Second World War. You can also click on the links that are provided in the video description to take a look at short videos regarding these three here. There's also a place in regards to Latinos and Chinese who, in the end, would be integrated alongside white Americans as well, some of them even becoming officers as well. But they, in a lot of ways, because they resided in sort of a racial gray area, they were allowed to be integrated into those particular forces. And you'll take a look at this in the next activity as well. And the other argument we're making is the overthrow of authoritarianism and eventual creation of democracy in these in places in Europe and in Asia as well. And what the United States contributed to this was the sheer material superiority and firepower that was accomplished by American industry in larger numbers than any other states. If you look at this here, the comparison between the United States and Japan, just the sheer amount of resources that were thrown at Japan. You also have now enough material to not just be utilized by the United States on two separate fronts across the world, but the Lend-Lease also sends American supplies and materials to the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and others. The United States particularly contributed for the Western Allies in operating with Britain and Free France on a great capacity, using a unified command whereby they joined together. They were not fighting. There was one single theme and one single goal where both the British, the French, and the United States all worked together to make a one vision for what the Western Front may look like. And finally, all of this with the bravery of the men and women in the American Armed Forces helped to win both on land, but then also to generate naval and air superiority on almost every single front. And as a result of their sacrifices, they're able to now expand liberties abroad. And particularly the promises made by FDR alongside Winston Churchill in what's known as the Atlantic Charter, made sure that this war was not about land exchange. This was not about imperialism. They were expanding empires, but the Atlantic Charter ensured that borders would not only remain the same before the war, but then also would help to create self-determination of states all across the world. Not something that Churchill necessarily wanted for his British Empire, but in convincing the United States to act on their behalf, he also agreed to the Atlantic Charter. And that's going to lead to global decolonization abroad. Now, it will take a few decades for this to happen, but the victory of the United States and Great Britain, and as it turns out, the Soviet Union, in the Second World War will lead in the end to decolonization and expansion of democracy across the world. Now, one great counter-argument, and really unfortunate counter-argument for this, is what we see with the incarceration of Japanese Americans from the West Coast of the United States. And it is a key counter-argument to the type of liberalism and democracy that we're arguing in this lecture. And so in the next assignment, what you're going to do is you're going to take a look at the changes in attitude towards Japanese Americans to be able to explore one, the context of attitudes, ideas towards immigrants, and particularly Japanese Americans in the 1920s, 30s, and eventually in the 1940s. And in this case here, to explore a number of primary source documents from Japanese Americans in Northern California. So this for us here is local. These are individuals from the Sacramento area particularly. And we're going to examine through these primary documents the legal, the economic, the social challenges faced by Japanese Americans, and also particularly the action and the agency that Japanese Americans took upon themselves to better their own livelihood despite the circumstances as a whole. So with that, go ahead and complete this assignment and the lecture questions that are provided.